We're ready to get started with the next session. Good afternoon, my name is Jordan Cantor, and I'm a 2014 Aspen Security Forum Scholar. I'm here to introduce the next session, Pivoting to Asia. This session will explore the geopolitical rise of China, the threat it poses to its neighbors in the region, and the implications for American security. It will be moderated by Josh Rogin, Senior Correspondent for the Daily Beast. Josh covers national security and politics and has previously written for Newsweek, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, Congressional Quarterly, Federal Computer Week magazine, and the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. He was a 2011 finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists and the 2011 recipient of the Interaction Award for Excellence in International Reporting. And as a friendly reminder, the last session of the day at 5:15 with Admiral Greenert will take place in the Greenwald Pavilion. And with that, the floor is yours, Josh.
Thank you so much for coming to this discussion of Asia. As you said, I'm Josh Rogin, and first of all, I'd like to thank the town, the people of Aspen, for hosting us so warmly and graciously this week. I have to say, I love it here. It's a vibrant town in a pristine neighborhood, and the genius of it, I think, is that you built an airport that only handles 2 planes a day, with 10 people maximum on each one. So that's the way to keep it cozy, and I'm for it, and thanks again. But we're here to talk about Asia. I'm excited to have an all-star panel here. I remember when I started dealing with Asia as an undergrad in 1980, and they told me that 21st century was going to be the Asian century. So I said, okay, great. I studied it, I lived there, I traveled there, I went to work for the Japanese newspaper, and I waited. Finally, in 2009, the Obama administration came to town and announced an ambitious plan, the pivot to Asia. And of course, it was later reread, the rebalance to Asia, although I'm told reliably by a senior official that there is one man who really preferred the term pivot, and that was President Obama himself. Is that true?
Not quite, but it's a basketball term, so it's easy reach for him.
Oh, okay. Excellent. So the pivot to Asia was very ambitious, and it had 2 main phases. The first phase, which I think was executed, in my opinion, with a great deal of success. It was the diplomatic re-engagement of America into the region. Visits, attention, just an overall tone. And the second phase, which some critics say was less of a success, was the actual shift of U.S. Resources, especially military resources, to Asia. This, of course, wasn't the administration's fault completely. There were a lot of things that intervened: the Arab Spring, sequestration, and so we have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way that we want it to be. But that's essentially what happened. And then, of course, Secretary Kerry came to the State Department, and I think it's fair to say he had a different set of priorities. I remember after Secretary Kerry went to Japan one time, he spent a few hours there, and then went to Israel and the West Bank shortly after. A Japanese diplomat called me and he said, Josh, what do we have to do to get John Kerry to stay in Japan longer? Build an Israeli settlement on the Senkaku Islands? And so, there's a gap between the real hard work of American officials trying to rebalance towards Asia and the perception in the region. And that's set upon the backdrop of a China that's increasingly aggressive, increasingly expanding its military, and increasingly suppressing dissent internally. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Now, Hillary Clinton famously said that when the senior leaders in the government are not paying attention to an issue, that's when the professionals can actually get stuff done. And so that leads me to our first speaker, one of the top professionals in Asia in the government, Assistant Secretary of State Danny Russel. He was previously the senior director at the National Security Council. He had a long career as a foreign service officer in Asia. And I'll open it up to you for your opening remarks.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Josh, and thanks to all of you in Aspen for the chance to be here. Look, I think first and foremost, the distinction between pivot and rebalance is an academic exercise. Dividing the rebalance strategy up into phase 1, phase 2, similarly is theoretical and fine. But fundamentally, rebalance translates into putting a strategic priority on U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's been a constant, certainly since President Obama took office in January of 2009. And it was predicated on the conviction that our economic future and our security interests throughout the 21st century, the century of the Pacific, are intimately tied together. One of the starting points has been strengthening our relations with our allies and our close security partners, such as Singapore. And I think it's fair to say objectively that those security relationships are in great shape. One of the beefs against the rebalance in the initial period was that it was too hard power. It was too much about our security presence. And we've worked hard to build out the economic and the people-to-people, the cultural, the other aspects of our rebalance, of our strategy in the Asia-Pacific. Second big piece of it has been trying to foster the growth of regional institutions built around the ASEAN framework, the ASEAN hub. There's a long-standing, if tacit, agreement between China and the United States that the security architecture that will provide the greatest stability is a security architecture that is built around what the Southeast Asians themselves have created, and that prevents Asia, let alone Southeast Asia, from becoming a battleground for great powers or forcing third countries in the region to choose, are they with China, are they with the United States? We've put a tremendous amount of energy into our relations with important emerging powers, India, of course, Indonesia for sure, and most obviously China. And the work that we've put into the relationship with China, I think, and certainly based on the 3 days that I spent with Secretary Kerry and Secretary Liu in Beijing earlier this month for our annual strategic and economic dialogue, has put a floor under the relationship that means that even when there are stresses and strains, even when tensions spike, fundamentally the commitment of each side to building a stable and constructive partnership is not in question. What we've tried to do is develop a relationship that allows both for increased practical cooperation on issues that we genuinely care about, and that deals directly with areas of difference and disagreements, not agree to disagree, but manage them and try to push through to some sort of resolution. That's been very important and top priority for us. I'll close just by saying that we have invested also heavily in both the economic arena, our efforts to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which I hope will come to fruition in the course of this year, are aimed at creating a new high-level, high-quality, comprehensive benchmark for genuinely free trade, something that the region would benefit hugely from. But there are many other economic initiatives, not only the KORUS, US-Korea trade agreement, and others, but also a lot on the energy and the climate and the environmental side. And then lastly, on what the president has called the values agenda, we do a tremendous amount of work in democratic institution building, in humanitarian assistance, and in good governance throughout the region. Our advocacy for human rights is not moralistic finger wagging, it's practical and ties into stability and to economics. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you. Before I move on to our next speaker, a couple of quick questions for you, Secretary. A recent Pew Research survey of 11 Asian countries said, during that survey, 8 of them said they still see America as their greatest ally. The 3 that didn't were Malaysia, Pakistan, and China. Only 3 saw China as their greatest security threat: Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Of course, these are the 3 that are engaged in, that are suffering from aggressive Chinese maritime tactics in disputed waters. Of course, the U.S. has a position that we don't take a role in the dispute, but we support the integrity of our allies and the territories that they control. But overall, how is it going, the effort to to communicate to China that there are lines that they shouldn't cross when expanding their activities in disputed areas. Do you see the Chinese responding to that? What more can be done to make sure this problem doesn't get worse?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that the demand signal for U.S. active presence, the support for bilateral relations with the U.S. and for alliances with the U.S. is so strong. The U.S., I think, is seen as a benign and a constructive and a stabilizing presence in the region. People want us there, and that, I think, is an important thing. We don't want countries in the region to see China as a threat, and we don't want China's behavior to generate concerns about China's long-term intentions. The President has been crystal clear in private and in public that we support, the United States, and there's a strong bipartisan backing for this, supports a stable, prosperous, growing China. We welcome the rise of a China that contributes to the region. And so the question of whether China's rise is a stabilizing factor, is a net plus, is really at the heart of our engagement and our strategy, both in the region and with China directly. So specifically, when it comes to the territorial disputes, I won't rehearse all the doctrine and dogma, but what I will say is it's not about rocks, it's about rules. We're perfectly happy. We create space for China to participate in reshaping the rules for the 21st century, but on the condition that China accepts that it too, like the United States, like Singapore, is bound by them.
So that's fair enough, but to be fair to China, other countries, including Japan and South Korea, have also not agreed that these disputes should be litigated in that way. Every time I talk to an Asian diplomat, they say, there is no dispute. That rock is ours.
I thought I was being fair to China. But look, you're absolutely right that the indisputability banner is constantly being chased by claimant countries.
Is it your analysis that China will continue to take unilateral moves, such as their establishment of the air zone? Or do you think that they've gotten the message and now they'll pause in doing aggressive things that will stoke tensions?
Yeah, well, I'm not in the business of trying to get inside the Chinese head, but it is certainly clear from the deployment of the deep sea oil rig to the waters of the Paracel that they paid a very significant price in reputational terms, in diplomatic terms, for an uncoordinated and unilateral action. Look, when it comes to the East China Sea, Prime Minister Abe in Singapore, I think very importantly said, look, we don't think the Chinese claim has merit, but if they want to take us to the ICJ and make their case, go for it. I think that's a healthy attitude. And the decision, for example, by the Philippines to refer to the tribunal of UNCLOS the question of whether the 9-dash line is consistent with conventional international law. And that decision was made on the basis of their conclusion that diplomacy wasn't getting them anywhere.
Sure.
Is legitimate. We don't back the Philippines in a case, but we back the right of any country to avail itself of an international mechanism.
Understood. I'm sure we'll get back to this during the Q&A. For those who don't know what UNCLOS is, it's the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It mitigates rules in the open waters, something that China has acceded to, but the US has not. Our next speaker is the ambassador from Singapore, Ashok Mirpuri, and please, remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Aspen, for shoehorning Asia into this 3 days of Middle East and Ukraine and homeland security, because this is really where the U.S. strategic interests for the 21st century are going to lie. And in the day-to-day issues that you have to deal with, each one of us has to deal with, longer-term strategic issues always get put aside. There's something we need to work on, but when you have a crisis to manage, so we understand that. And I want to offer a perspective from the region, making 3 points on the US, on China, and on the maritime disputes. On the US, I think there's a very deep understanding that the US is a global power in Southeast Asia, and we understand why Secretary Kerry has got to go to the Middle East and try and resolve the difficulties there. We're fortunate that the region does not have conflicts like there are in the Middle East. And in a way, you then can let the professionals get on to their job. You dismiss the role of trips and visits. They're actually very important in Asia. The warm handshake, the ability for people to turn up, the putting into place some of these structures were very important in that first phase of the rebalance after President Obama came in. It was an important way of showing that the U.S. wanted to play a role. So the U.S. ceded to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. They have an ambassador to ASEAN in Jakarta. The president now attends the East Asia Summit annually. And when he couldn't make it last year, he made a special effort to make an extra trip this year. I think all these are recognized, that how important it is. More important is this recognition that the U.S. is a resident power in the Asia Pacific, that the U.S. has actually shaped the Asia Pacific as it is today. That for more than 50 years, for more than half a century, the prosperity and stability of the region has been because the U.S. has played a key role. Now, we want the U.S. to continue to play that into the future. And the rebalance is a very important part of this, but it's got to carry on. And it's got to go beyond just the security. They've spoken of moving 60% of the naval forces into the Asia-Pacific region. Well, these are numbers, but it's got to have broader aspects to it. And that's where the economic engagement comes in, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Singapore is working with the U.S. and 10 other countries to put in place an avenue for strategic engagement of the U.S. with the region. Because many of you here come from different companies. Commercially, your markets are going to be in the Asia Pacific. You need to have the rules and structures of the future. When we talk about issues around cybersecurity and all these things, internet protocols, how do we get the new rules in place in a world where these are the new opportunities for you? On China, the second point, yes, in many ways, people speak about China as a threat, but that's not the view from Southeast Asia. From Southeast Asia, China is now probably the #1 trading partner for all Southeast Asian countries. And if it's not #1, it is #2. China presents tremendous opportunities for all the countries of the region. Their investments, the businesses going back and forth, the tourist movement, students, this is a real change happening in our region. And something very, very dramatic in terms of how the region views China. We see the rise of China, and it's working around the rules that Danny spoke about that become an important part of saying this rise of China, we try to address the frictions and potential tensions that could come up. And that's how do we manage that? And that, again, a continued U.S. engagement is a very critical part of this. Now, talking about the frictions and the tensions, the maritime security issues do become where they've become most obvious. And whether it's around the issues of nationalism or new rising powers, it's Japan and China, Japan and Korea in Southeast Asia. Singapore is not a claimant state to the South China Sea disputes. But we do see it as an issue that ASEAN has to deal with, that ASEAN needs to work out, again, with outside partners, how do we define a way to resolve these disputes, which may take a long time. But until we get to a point where we can resolve these disputes, to make sure that freedom of navigation is maintained, that international law is used, that there is a peaceful resolution. So we're working towards a code of conduct, ASEAN and China. How do we define this? But I think the most important thing that I take away from the rebalance is really the importance that the U.S. has given to Southeast Asia. For a long time, while the U.S. was engaged in the Asia-Pacific, obviously China was important, Japan and Korea as your allies. But I think that what we have seen in the past 4 or 5 years has been this focus on Southeast Asia. And that's really where we want to see it continue.
Excellent, thank you. It's totally true that when you talk to Asia people in the Obama administration, they see a rebalance from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. I think that's recognized in the region. But let me ask you very quickly, your country is known for decades as being the best at balancing their relationships with the U.S. and China, being friendly and having constructive relations with both. The longtime President Lee Kuan Yew wrote a book about it, right? But according to reports, when his son, the current leader, came to Washington in April, he called on the Obama administration to do more. In other words, he said that it was out of balance, according to news reports. Don't always trust what you read in the news. So I wanted to ask you, is that accurate, and what's that a reflection of?
Well, first, it's a small country, and we're a very small country of 5 million people. You have to be friends with everybody. And being friends with everyone means you've got to deal with the big powers. The Prime Minister was in Washington in June. He came last year in April, and this year in June. He keeps a regular schedule of visits to the US and to China. He will go to China later this year. It's his way of being up to date on developments, but also what he wanted to use his visit for, particularly the June visit, was to put across how important the rebalance is, how elements of the rebalance, it was an opportunity to speak about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Prime Minister went out to Congress and spoke to members of Congress, how strategically important this economic engagement is for the US. So, and he'll go to China and keep the point to them as well of how important it is that China plays a constructive role in the region. So as a small country, whether you call it a balancing position or what, our position is really looking at the world as it stands and taking it as it is. We cannot shape it, unlike the US. You have a bigger role to shape it. China can shape it. We just take the world as it is and work around those constraints.
So did the Prime Minister tell U.S. officials that that they needed to do more to confront a rising China?
We always, I wouldn't say confront a rising China. The Prime Minister wanted the US to keep actively engaged in the region because of what the US has done. And it's not just about China. It's managing, there are tensions that emerge because of what Japan is doing. As Japan wants to become a normal country, there are new tensions emerging. I think that the US has that overarching role to play to keep these tensions in check. Whether they emerge because of China, Vietnam, because of Japan, China, Korea, and Japan, these are tensions that are there. So only the US can play a role in managing these.
Very diplomatic. Thank you. Last question. Do you think, how seriously should we take the threat of tensions in the disputed areas? I mean, we see the militarization of these rocks, and we see fishing boats and cruisers getting into conflicts, and we're worried, frankly, here that this could trigger a broader conflict that could ensnare lots of different countries. Is that a valid concern? What would you say?
I think that the big concern is an accident. Nobody wants to have a conflict break out. Each side will try and take advantage of what opportunities they see, and it's really avoiding the accidents. That drunk fishing boat captain in the middle of the night who decides to exert the sovereignty for his country on a piece of rock that is completely meaningless, but it could just trigger off a series of actions and counteractions that just give rise to new uncertainties. And that's where we're trying to work around this code of conduct, that at least there are hotlines, there are abilities for people to reach out to each other to say, this is an accident, let's not react to these things. And that's how we're trying to play that.
Excellent. Thank you. Our final speaker is Ambassador Chris Hill, currently the Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, formerly the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, your job now, and the former top negotiator for the U.S. delegation to the last semi-functional round of six-party talks in 2005. Ambassador?
Thanks very much, Josh. I don't remember any bit of the last part you mentioned, but...
Well, when I was a reporter at that time for the Japanese newspaper, my job was to stalk you. And that often involved driving out to Dulles Airport. And I'm sure you don't remember, but...
I do. I just thought you liked me. Look, I think anyone who's worked on East Asia, who's seen the potential there, just the utter vastness of the place, the countries there, the diversity, has always had a feeling that we should be paying more attention to this part of the world. I mean, I think there's certainly that feeling, but when you look at the sort of bandwidth among senior officials in Washington, how much time in the day they have to go to meetings, things like that, you realize one important lesson of Washington, which is the urgent tends to crowd out the important. And so as important as as East Asia is, it could not trump the urgency of issues elsewhere. So I think the idea of a rebalancing was, I think, very, very good news to those of us who feel that East Asia needs to be paid attention to. But I think like a lot of things in life, it's not what you say you're going to do, it's actually how you do it. And unfortunately, I think there were some unintended consequences which we are still dealing with. The first is, I think, the consequence that I'll call it the pivot, but it came out about the time of the Arab Spring. And I think for many people in the Middle East, it somehow signaled that the United States was just tired of the Middle East. And yet the Arab Spring was probably, I think historians, hundreds of years from now will be looking back at that Arab Spring as an absolutely seminal moment in the Middle East. And there'll be this sense, well, where was the U.S.? So I think one of the unintended consequences was the notion that we were done with the Middle East. Another unintended consequence, And I think we felt it somewhat lately has been the view in Europe that somehow they're not important anymore. We should, they should solve their own problems. So, and we've seen that film before. You remember before the Balkans. So, and then thirdly, as we started paying more attention to the aspirations, the great potential, the great accomplishments, really, of East Asia, it became in the sort of same context of some of our other engagements in other parts of the world. That is, we're now going to confront a rising power. We're now going to confront a country that is clearly out to no good, for no good, and that was China. And I think, so for many people in East Asia, they kind of remembered the old Asian expression, be careful what you wish for, because nobody in East Asia wanted to be choosing between the US and China. All that said, I think what is done, and I think clearly the US has increased its profile in East Asia. I think it's been very welcome, especially as China so beset by these internal problems. And I don't think there's a country in the world that has worse internal problems. Well, I'll put aside Iraq for a second, but I think China has to deal with a lot right now. And I think it's manifesting itself in some pretty bellicose and some pretty unhelpful, to use that diplomatic word, unhelpful actions in a South China Sea that the Chinese want to turn into a southern Chinese lake. Certainly, there are issues with Japan. There are problems in Japan, but China has not managed it very well. They have not managed any of the countries around them. And one of the reasons is they don't have a kind of Westphalian notion that everyone's an equal and we've got to, work on issues of sovereignty. They look at these countries around them as somehow tributary states. And these are bad habits that were a long time in coming, and they're not going to go away today. So I think we have a major challenge in kind of helping to manage the region and make sure that the means by which China grows and thrives is a means that will, I think, benefit everybody, including China. So I really do believe, notwithstanding that Danny is sitting here, that we send some of our best guys out to the Middle East for precisely that reason. I mean, these are really complex problems where you do have, I think, long-term implications. One of the great, anyone coming out of the European theater, as I did earlier in my career, where, you watch Euro News and you see one delegation pulling up to a building while another delegation and another set of motorcades is pulling away, and you thought, geez, how many organizations do they need in this part of the world? Well, whatever they have in Europe in terms of organizations, they don't have it in East Asia. And so often these problems, whether outcroppings of rocks and things like that, they go to this very kind of brutal bilateral channel. And they really are really tough to kind of put into a park in some sort of multilateral thing, which the Europeans have gotten very good at. And they've gotten good at it because they have bitter experiences. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be done in East Asia. We need to, first of all, understand that wagging your finger at people isn't going to work. And I think, frankly, we need to learn that lesson everywhere. But we have to be very careful dealing with it in East Asia. And secondly, I think we need to help people build structures. And if structures, anyone who's gone to the Pacific Island Forum, I've had the pleasure of doing that, Danny, I'm sure. There's something which I used to call the Pacific Stare. You'd sit there and they'd look at you and you'd look at them and no one would say anything for 5 minutes. And, I would be one of those sort of get-to-the-point Americans. But the Pacifics, they were quite happy, just kind of staring at you, whether they're from Tonga. And so we have to kind of get over this notion that we have to have a transaction in the first 2 minutes of our encounters there, and try to develop the kind of longer-term relationships that I think befits the notion that we're going to be there a long time.
Excellent. Thank you. One quick question I have to ask you. North Korea.
What's that?
Well, so let me ask the question.
Yeah.
The Obama administration's approach, absent 6 months of negotiations or in 2011 and 2012, has largely been described as strategic patience. The conditions are not right. We're going to strengthen alliances, and we're going to keep the pressure on and depend on China to move North Korea. How do you think that's going? What is your?
It's not going well, obviously, but I'm not sure I would put the finger of blame on the Obama administration for that. When I got into that, it was beginning of 2005, and if you look at opinion surveys in South Korea, you found upwards of 50% of the people in South Korea were blaming the United States for North Korea's nuclear aspirations. So when you have put yourself in the position of helping North Korea with their public diplomacy and making them look like the victims, you know you had a wrong policy. And by the way, it was accompanied by people in Washington issuing sort of blood-curdling speeches for South Korean audiences, telling them that somehow they're not tough enough, they don't understand what they're dealing with in North Korea. I can tell you that didn't go over too well with people living, 17 miles from the DMZ. So I think we changed our policy in the second term of the Bush administration. We said, if you want to see negotiations, fasten your seatbelt, because we are going to go through this as hard and fast as we can, and we're going to see what we can get out of this. And eventually, we got them to stop the plutonium production. We got them to even disable some things. We kept the door open on the issue that we really worried about all along, which was the uranium enrichment. The North Koreans always wanted to say, we haven't done it, we've never done it, we want to shut the door and forget about that. We refused to do it. Ultimately, the talks ended when, in the summer of '08, when Kim Jong-il became Kim Jong-very ill and was clearly not in a position to make any decisions. And so we were not able to get verification. We got a kind of phony baloney declaration, but frankly, we weren't going to believe anything the North Koreans said in terms of a declaration. What we needed was a verification protocol. We didn't get that, and we pulled the plug. I think the Obama administration has looked to restart the talks, but I think they've asked for one thing that makes a lot of sense to me, which is the North Koreans agreed in September 2005 that they would they would abandon all their nuclear programs. And now the North Koreans say, oh, we'd love to go back to the talks, but no preconditions. So what they're saying is they want to have talks, but they don't want to acknowledge they made any agreement before. So it's like trying to negotiate with someone who has amnesia. I mean, you really can't get them to acknowledge anything that they did before. And frankly, it allows them to sort of play around with negotiations. So I think the U.S. has been wise not to jump into that. I think the U.S. has been wise to continue to put a lot of pressure on China, because whether the Chinese know it or not, if they really stopped supporting North Korea, and I'm not talking about the fact that they didn't send Kim Jong-un a Valentine this year, but I mean, if they really decided they didn't want those guys surviving, they could make that point. And they haven't done it. Why they haven't done it is a lot of reasons, but sure. I think mainly it has to do with the notion that the Chinese, there's a lot of old think there, and if North Korea goes down, that's a victory for America, a defeat for them. It's that simple. So I think we have to keep at it. And I think the Obama administration, being patient is a good policy there, okay. But also being vigilant, thickening up missile defense, I think has been a good idea, continuing to work with partners, and by the way, strengthen the notion of multilateralism, which is where I started with.
Thank you. I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. I want to ask one more for each of you to answer. As we see China rising, as we see economic liberalization, we don't see political liberalization. We don't see, actually, the trends in persecution, human rights, are all going in the wrong direction. I think we would all agree. So the question is, can we peacefully manage or cooperate with China on its rise without addressing the Chinese government's mistreatment of its own people and its refusal to reform those policies?
Well, we do very much and very directly address the human rights and other curtailments of freedoms in China. But as I said earlier, not as an exercise in proselytizing and in preaching, but in very practical terms. I think the proof point that the U.S. is serious in saying that we want a stable and prosperous China, consider the alternative, is that we raise with them consistently in the context of freedom of the press, in the context of NGOs, in the context of space for civil society in the context of the rule of law, why it is important for China to allow its citizens to operate openly and freely. It's germane in terms of the ability of businesses to succeed in China. It's directly tied to entrepreneurship and innovation, which is the secret of economic success in the 21st century. And importantly, it's critical to stability in a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation like China. We talk to the Chinese about counterterrorism. And one of the points that we make is to differentiate between the legitimate exercise of civil rights or political views or even civil disobedience and terrorist actions. That's a critical distinction. And to the extent that China applies brute force as a solution to the very daunting social, political, and economic problems that it's facing at home, as Chris alluded to, it can't be successful. I think, just in closing, I really want to foot stomp the point that Chris has made about regional institutions. And this is very germane for China and for China's behavior, not only in the international stage, but in its periphery. We need to accept that rules bind us, that might does not make right, and that we will benefit from restraint. And whether the issue is the treatment of Uyghur minority in China's Xinjiang region, whether it is the territorial disputes in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, or frankly, whether it is the way that China uses cyber technology to allow for the theft of intellectual property that then gets commercialized. Adherence to rules is the secret of success.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador?
Well, one thing is a small country. We don't tell the Chinese or the Americans how to run their country. So we're very careful about that. But, you know,
I beg to differ.
when you look at China, just looking at the social media, it's become a very, very vibrant social media. There are feedback mechanisms that the party has, that local governments have, and they have to function within those constraints as well. As you know, they go around telling everybody, we do have constraints in dealing with some of these disputes, maritime disputes, because of the nationalist pressure emerging from the social media. So it's going to start to change some of the things that they're having to do. But you know, it's really something that they will have to work through as they move into this 21st century world as well.
Thank you.
You know, I think it's important to differentiate between human rights on the one side and telling a government or a country how to organize their governmental structures. I'm a strong believer in democracy because I think it's the best way to safeguard human rights. But I think we need to be very careful not to be giving unsolicited advice on how countries should organize themselves, except insofar as the principles we're talking about are international rules-based. So I think we can expect, you know, we can certainly approach the Chinese on any number of issues that are international, whether WTO, et cetera. On human rights, I think we have an obligation to ourselves, to them, to everybody, to speak clearly about this. But I think how you do it is important. I had many discussions, frank discussions, with the Chinese on human rights. But what I didn't do is go out and talk to the press about it. And I remember I saw Condoleezza Rice go through lists of people we were trying to get out of prison. And I accompanied Hillary Clinton on her first trip there. She did the same thing. We went through lists of people to try to get them, but she didn't do it publicly. And I think that goes to a second point, which is if you're going to talk about human rights, to what effect are you trying to do that? Are you trying to get people out of prison? Are you trying to make a clear message to your interlocutors? Or are you trying to embarrass them and make yourself look good? And I would argue that you should do the former and not the latter.
Are those mutually exclusive?
I think sometimes in a place like China, when you go to the press and you bash the Chinese for their human rights, you are not going to improve the human rights situation, and I think odds are you might actually make it worse. Now, if people ask you about your human rights in public, of course, you should make very clear what you feel. But I think you need to be very careful about showing a little sensitivity to how some of these public messages are received. But that, in my mind, doesn't change the fact that when you have the opportunity to speak in traditional channels, you have to make it very clear that this is important to you and this is not for sale, whether you're trying to sell an airplane or something. These human rights issues are very important. And by the way, one thing about the Chinese is if you deal with them honestly and directly, and not necessarily for other reasons in the media. I don't mean to knock the media, Josh, but I think the Chinese take it very well. Believe me, they can take a punch. They just don't like to get that kind of thing in public.
Understood. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions. Right there, sir, in the back.
I have a question for
I'm
Secretary
sorry, could
Russel.
you please identify yourself?
My name is
Thank you.
Tom Korologos in Washington, D.C. I have a question for Secretary Russell. You keep talking about, I wrote it down, they abide by the rules, they deal openly. I look at that sign behind you. IBM, Intel, Microsoft, Raytheon, Target, all representatives on the front row. I'll bet you each one of them can tell you a war story, how the Chinese have copyright shafted them, how they've taken SEC rules and not abide by them when they bring their stuff in here, how they have broken all kinds of normal trade policy issues with dumping and what have you. Now I can't figure out my question, but
I would ask everybody to put their comment in the form of a question. But
Thank you, Tom, and it's been many years, but it's great to see you again. As the Chinese economy starts developing its own intellectual property and creating more and more intellectual capital, Chinese businesses and Chinese stakeholders are discovering the magic of protecting intellectual property. The challenge that we're facing is that as a country making the transition from a developing to a developed industrialized nation, they don't have the decades that the US and other developed countries have had. This is moving on an incredibly compressed time frame. So it is, in fact, pressure from the United States, pressure from elsewhere that has been instrumental in compelling the Chinese to begin putting into place, whether it has to do with government procurement or it has to do with the enforceability of contracts, rules that protect, in the first instance, foreign companies, and then now increasingly in the second instance, rules that protect Chinese companies themselves. Here's the crux of the problem, though. Absent a legal system that allows for an objective adjudication of disputes, in a one-party system in which the party interests will always trump the law, there's no reliable mechanism, there's no certainty, there's no recourse when a company, whether Chinese or Western, is faced with Guangxi, is faced with a special relationship. And that you can draw a direct line from the tremendous frustration felt among Chinese citizens to the corruption campaigns that are so visibly underway right now. It's not a matter of US politics, it's not a matter of democratic values. The human urge for fairness is what's driving that.
It's excellent. As a quick follow-up, do you believe that the US case against China for ongoing cyber, corporate, and military espionage was undermined last year by the revelation that the NSA and other US agencies were conducting mass collection? It seemed that that the Chinese at least used that to, let's say, take the steam out of our drive to confront them on those important issues.
Well, the brouhaha over Edward Snowden's revelations created phenomenal set of talking points for countries like China that want to change the subject and want to criticize us. I think the simple way of looking at it is to make a differentiation between the spy versus spy stuff, the cyber war, the cybersecurity stuff, and a very simple proposition, namely that stealing someone else's property, intellectual property, including through cyber means, transferring it to a state-owned enterprise with government concurrence and complicity, and then having that state-owned enterprise commercialize the product and put it back on the market to the detriment of the originators of the property is wrong and should stop. That's our point, and that is utterly without reference to what's happening on the national security front.
Thank you. Oh, quick
I'd
point.
just like to say, I think China is one of the worst on these issues. And I mean, it's just time and time again. And if you look at some of the American corporations that have tried to do business there and the reverse engineering that's gone on, I think it is outrageous and highly appropriate for us to be taking these cases. And whether the Chinese will find some example of NSA as some sort of countervailing talking point, I think we need to stay on our message. I will say that I served in South Korea from 1985 to 88, and the South Koreans were pretty bad then too. And it was only after the South Koreans developed name brands, Samsung, et cetera, that they realized that they, alas, were also going to have to listen or live with international rules because they helped the South Koreans. So the hope is that you just continue to work this, and eventually the Chinese will understand that those rules can protect them as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question. Right here.
Thank you. Gopal Ratnam, reporter with Bloomberg News. A question for all of you. So if you look at the biggest conflicts now in Europe with Putin's action grabbing Crimea and with the Syria and the Assad regime continuing to survive despite the administration having drawn red lines and done nothing, why should countries in Asia believe that the United States, smaller countries, should they believe that the United States will come to their aid in case China were to act tough with them? Particularly since, I mean, like Ambassador Hill said, China sees some of their countries as tributary states, just like Putin sees some of the countries on the margin of Russia as ethnic enclaves that should belong ideally to Russia. And one point for Secretary Russell, you express optimism that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be done by this year. There are several countries in that part of the world that have skepticism that the trade deal will not be done even by the end of this administration. Why do you believe it'll be done by this year?
Okay, let's start with your question of why small Asian countries should trust the United States to come get them. We'll start with Mr. Ambassador.
Perfect person to ask.
Yep. There's no one else we can turn to. So it's really establishing the rules. And that's what is critical. And how do you get rules in place that would get either the US to come out or other alliance partners to come out and play rules? And that's the critical part of it. I don't think the Chinese, notwithstanding Chris's point about China seeing tributary relationships, they have to deal with the world, the modern world. It's no longer a 19th century world or an 18th century world where they can deal with it in a different manner. And they will see the interest for them in order to operate under the 21st century world. Some of their actions have alienated countries in the region. I'm sure they feel unhappy with this. They would like, how do you get China to be respected by the region is the key. You can be very strong, but you may not be respected. I think emphasizing that in all our conversations with them, in all the regional conversations with them, how do you build up a relationship? And the US has, how do you in fact make them appear to be like the US is? Your Pew survey that you referred to. How do you get those numbers up for China, that China is seen in a far more positive perspective from that region? Now, what role the US plays? The US has reinforced some of their messages to Japan on Article 5. They've signed this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with Philippines. They are active in the region. And that is one part of keeping the freedom of navigation, keeping the sea lanes open, reinforcing international rules. And the question is, can you then move everyone away to a position where international law is far more important than size or might is right, and not to allow one party or the other to tear the region apart?
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Russell, can you give us some news today on TPP so Bloomberg can write us a scoop?
Sure.
Tell us something that we didn't know before.
Sure. But first, let me just add to what Ashok said and say, I think that in addition to the record of the last 6 decades, which provides a baseline for faith in the credibility of the U.S. Security commitment, and in addition to the 6, now soon to be 7 visits that Secretary Kerry's made to the region, the extent to which President Obama not only has traveled but has hosted so many leaders from Asia, that investment of time. I think also the countries in the region take comfort from the fact that we are investing so much time in our relationship with China. The president's met something like 19 plus times with Chinese leaders since he's been in office. We just spent 2+ days with a big fraction of the U.S. cabinet in Beijing in very in-depth strategic talks. I think the fact that the U.S. doesn't pull punches with China, but is committed to build a constructive relationship within this framework of rules and norms is one of the confidence-inspiring dynamics at work. In terms of TPP, there are 2 fundamental bases for my confidence. One is the 4.5 years I spent at the White House in the National Security Council working for President Obama and working alongside Mike Froman. There's not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that the Obama administration from the top down is committed to pushing forward with the TPP because it is not only of tremendous economic and commercial value to the United States, but it also has great strategic value. We all benefit from it. Secondly, when President Obama in April went to Japan, I think he really brought the negotiations over a major hump. The 3rd largest economy on earth and a country that has a long history of fighting rearguard actions against tariff reduction made what is clearly now a fundamental decision to embrace the structural reforms that will be necessary for Japan to join TPP. And so the momentum that's created by economies that constitute something on the order of 40% of global GDP now aligned with a clear goal, I think gives tremendous impetus and forward momentum.
George, can I add something on TPP?
Sure. One quickly, Assistant Secretary Russell. Can China be part of TPP?
I think that Mike Froman and even the president have said that we would welcome a world in which China met the standards that the 12 countries in TPP have set for themselves.
So yes, but not now.
Well, not now, because we've got 12 countries. That's what I wanted. It is highly complicated negotiating a trade agreement among 12 countries. Singapore has a bilateral free trade agreement with the US. It took us 4 years to come to an agreement, and a completely asymmetric economic relationship. It still took us 4 years. These are 12 very different countries, and having the US and Japan in there makes it very complicated. There are 2 parts of this. There's the TPP, and then there's getting it through Congress. And I think that's an important part, that having the businesses here, for you to see the value of having this high standards agreement and making sure that when it does come up to Congress, when we finally finish this complicated agreement and put it through, that you see value in it for the U.S. strategic engagement with the region, for your economic advantages, and making sure that this gets through Congress, that we can have an agreement soon.
Excellent.
Just quickly, I think Danny would bear me out on this. If you go to China, there are a lot of people in China who believe that they have totally mishandled their relationships in Southeast Asia. They're not yet sure how to get out of it, but if you visit the Philippines and you hear the reference to China as a bully, If you certainly visit the Vietnamese, you know how the Chinese are being perceived, and the Chinese are aware of it. And I would not be surprised if they didn't improve their act in coming years.
Great. Did you get what you need? Excellent. Next, maybe. Yes, sir.
Ernie Cooney, attorney and former Air Force officer, B-52s, spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. Do you think the United States overreacted to China's expansion of the air defense identification zone into the East China Sea?
No, and it's for this reason, because it was another step in a series of sudden unilateral actions, heedless of the interests and the equities of the neighbors, that clearly was adding up to part of a threatening pattern, number one. Number two, it was an effort by China, on the face of it, to seek to deny access to the United States to international airspace. And that is something that runs counter to the fundamental tenet that the U.S. is determined to defend, and that is responsible for the stability and the prosperity of the Asian region over the last 6 decades. No one in the United States government ever argued that China as a nation doesn't have the right to create an air defense identification zone. Our objection was how they did it. And that's a really important distinction in connection with all of these issues that touch on territory, because we don't have a stake in which island, which rock goes to whom. We don't profit or lose if the Philippines prevails or the Chinese prevail, as long as they prevail through legitimate diplomatic or legal means. Similarly, on the ADIZ, we don't object to China having an ADIZ, but how that is formulated, what territory it covers, that matters hugely. And in the case of the Chinese ADIZ declaration, quite apart from all the other problems associated with the rollout, it encompassed territory controlled by another country, administratively controlled by Japan, and it was completely inconsistent with the existing flight information region, putting potentially untold numbers of civilian aircraft in jeopardy.
Should the FAA put a ban on flying there?
Look, the FAA is
Just
an
kidding.
administrative agency that makes decisions based on the safety of
I gave it a shot.
passengers.
All right, next question. Sir, in the middle. Then we'll go to the back. That'll be about it.
Thanks. Mark Anderson, InventIP. I thought your comment was an excellent one. And I know these companies well, and they've all been hit by China. When we look at InventIP at the global economy, we don't start at the bottom and try to ratchet up the cost of those attacks. We think that the entire economy worldwide is driven by technology. Pretty clear that's true. If anybody wants to argue, see me later. So if that's the case, that's $84 trillion a year at risk. And if there is a worldwide effort in 417 named sectors to steal crown jewel intellectual property, the results can be catastrophic. And I think we're just seeing the very first waves of that. So the question for you is, do you see any way, as this continues to ramp up, for the nations which invent things to bring that process to a reduction, at least, if not a halt?
Well, you're asking a question that takes me well beyond my area of expertise, but let me give you 2 pieces. Number one, the